Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our final session of the day. Before we start, we're going to give a couple of Zoom webinar reminders. So if you experience any Zoom technical issues, please call 1-888-799-9666 and choose option 2. Your audio will be streamed through your speakers. And please submit questions at any time using the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. You can also upvote and comment on others' questions. This webinar is recorded, and that recording, along with the slides and session summaries, will all be posted on our website, bftp.org. So now I'm going to pass it over to Jim Luther to introduce the session.
Thanks, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our continued discussion regarding science and security, or foreign interference. As Pamela and I said at the May in-person meeting, these issues, in large part, were formalized back in August of 2018, although they certainly existed long before that. But many of today's presenters have been with us almost at every meeting for the past 5 years, and we truly appreciate that. I also wanted to thank the Research Security Subcommittee and members of the Foreign Influence Working Group as they provided lots of input to these slides and these materials. Next slide. So as you saw in the description, we are focused on a continued discussion from many of the topics that we talked about in May. Our 5 federal partners need no introduction. I'll do that very briefly. As you can see at the bottom, Dr. Rebecca Keiser and Jean Feldman from NSF, Michelle Bowles from NIH, Jason Day from DoD, and Jeremy Ison from Department of Energy. Again, they need no formal introduction because they've been here so many times. What we plan on doing today is very briefly talk about some ongoing activities. We will have the federal partner updates and then some Q&A for 10 or 12 minutes. And then Pamela is going to close with some updates on some of the research security standards prioritization that FDP has been working on over the past month or two. Next slide. This is my sole transition slide before I turn it over to Dr. Keiser. In the interest of time, we're keeping our introductory notes very short. This is simply a list of hot topics, some of them since our May meeting, some of them that have been around for a bit. I would imagine all of them, or some of them or all of them, will be touched upon today. So in advance of this, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, thank our panelists for joining us, and now I'll turn it over to Dr. Rebecca Keiser.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you all. It's a pleasure to be with you again. I'm going to provide you with some updates from NSF on what's happening with NSPM-33 and CHIPS and Science. If I do not touch on something, please do put a question in the Q&A. We're happy to address it, and you all know me. I'm pretty much an open book, and I'll tell you what I can tell you. Next slide, please. This diagram is something that we've developed recently because we do get asked, how do research integrity and research security relate to one another? And the way that we look at this is that research integrity, of course, is the values that comprise the underpinning of our research ecosystem, both ours in the United States and those in our international partners. They're made up of the values that we treasure and of course, we want to uphold. Research security is the cell membrane, and we think about it as a cell membrane because it's porous, but we want to safeguard the integrity of our research ecosystem. So if you click again, you'll see that we want the system to be both open and secure. So another couple of clicks there on the slide. So we don't view openness and security as being opposite one another. We view them as complementary. And again, that's what we get asked time and time again. Openness is key to this system. We want to safeguard these values. Next slide, please. The CHIPS and Science Act of 2022, we're celebrating the 1-year anniversary because it was passed in August, and it includes several research security provisions. Number one, the prohibition of malign foreign government talent recruitment programs for those who wish to apply for and receive U.S. government federal research funding. And Jean will tell you a little bit more as part of the harmonized research security disclosure requirements, how we're incorporating this into our overall thinking and the requirements. I'll talk to you as well about the requirement for NSF to establish a research security and integrity information sharing and analysis organization, which is a mouthful. So we're calling it the Secure Center, and I'll tell you more about that. There's a training requirement for all covered personnel to take research security training, and also for research security training to be part of the responsible and ethical conduct of research training. We are not going to make this a requirement until we have the training available for you. We are co-funding research security training modules together with Department of Energy, NIH, and Department of Defense. These modules are being developed through cooperative agreements with the community. We're expecting them to be complete by December of 2023, cross fingers, and we now have funding, hopefully, if it's appropriated in 2024, to make these modules available to the community to download and use as your overall training, as part of your overall training. The requirement to make sure that institutions certify that they're making this training available to senior personnel or key personnel is going to be then put into place after that. So more to come on the timeline for that requirement. There is reporting required on foreign financial transactions and gifts. So as you know, there is the Section 117 Department of Education requirement starting next year. And again, this is in the draft PAPPG for 2024. There is a requirement for institutions of higher education that receive NSF funding to report to us annually on foreign financial transactions above $50,000 from countries of concern, which are the People's Republic of China, the Russian Federation, Iran, and North Korea. We're busy getting that reporting system into place. We're expecting that the first report will be due to us in July, the end of July 2024. You can see the draft standards in the PAPPG. We are taking in the input that came for the PAPPG comments and refining the reporting. And so the final reporting requirements will be out shortly. And the reporting again will be due at the end of July of 2024. And if an institution of higher education has a Confucius Institute, they cannot apply for NSF funding unless they apply for a waiver. We are coordinating closely with Department of Defense on both their definition of Confucius Institutes and their waiver process, so that we'll be working hand in hand with them. Next slide, please. Overall, we know that this environment for research and for researchers is changing, and it's challenging. Where's the bright line? We hear this again and again between what researchers are allowed to collaborate in and do and what they're not. What are the clarifications on disclosure? What appointments are acceptable for a researcher to accept and what aren't? This is a confusing environment. We're all adapting to it as well. That's why we're trying to be as clear as possible, both in our definitions and disclosure, as well as what needs to be disclosed to us. But there'll be additional questions, and their information itself is morphing as we speak. And so we're looking at this research security and integrity information sharing and analysis organization, which we're now calling SECURE, as the bridge between researchers and institutions and the US government. SECURE stands for Safeguarding the Entire Community in the US Research Ecosystem. And if you go to the next slide, talk a little bit about what it's going to do. We hope that it's going to empower the research community to make security-informed decisions about research security concerns. We're going to do this by the Secure Center, providing information, developing tools, and providing services to the community itself. Again, this is a center that is geared for services to the community, not to the government, but it's going to be that bridge between the government and the community. It is geared towards independent institutions of higher education, nonprofit research institutions, and small and medium-sized businesses. And this is what's in the law, but we hope that it has as broad as accessibility as possible. Next slide, please. So what is it going to do? We want it to provide uniform quality of service. That means we want it to be accessible to everyone and every entity in the research ecosystem. Now, of course, we have a big research community here. And so the way it's going to work is that questions and requests for information are going to come in through research organizations and institutions and businesses, through single or a set of points of contact from that organization. So researchers themselves will provide questions and requests for information into those points of contact. They'll then request it from the center. We hope that it's going to reduce cost and administrative burden by the provision of these tools and this information. We want it to provide frameworks and best practices as we develop them within the government and as they're developed by others in the community. We want syntheses of information to be provided out in a curated format, which means we want information to be geared towards researchers. I think you've all seen articles, you've seen other sources of information that seems more geared towards large companies. It seems more geared and focused on aspects that aren't really as relevant to the research itself. And so this information has to be curated and geared towards this particular audience. We hope that it conveys patterns of risk. We look at it almost like a National Weather Service, where it can point to, here's what the forecast looks like it's going to be over the next several days, and then here's what the climate might look like over the next several months. But we're not going to tell you what you have to do with that information. So the National Weather Service gives you the chance of rain. You decide whether to take your umbrella or not. This center is going to do a similar type of thing, and it's also going to provide you with the analytical tools to help you do that assessment. Now, if you click again, it'll tell you what the center is not going to do. And the center is not going to make decisions on behalf of the community. It's not going to be doing investigations on researchers or institutions. And it's not going to be making policy. And these are extremely important. If something comes into the Secure Center and it's more geared towards something that should be an investigation, the center will say, here's where we recommend you provide that information within the US government, but it's not suited for the center itself. If you need a decision, again, here's where you should go. It won't be the center, and for policy as well. Next slide, please. The next thing I want to talk to you about is the Research on Research Security program. This also is part of CHIPS and Science. It's something that we're excited about funding. We did a JSON study, and what we asked them is, what would be most helpful if NSF were to fund a program to do research in the area of research security? The JSON said, number one, the issue of research security is real, and we need to find out more about it. And second, US researchers often do feel threatened or frightened, and that's real as well. And we have to take that into account. We need to think about the consequences and appropriate actions related to breaches of research security, because they do differ among STEM fields. The definition of research integrity differs across national interests and cultures. And so that's something else to think about when we are thinking about how we structure this research program. We have an NSF internal project on identification of potential breaches of research integrity and security. And this is using an analysis of open source data. And so this type of tool could be helpful for a research program as well. STEM PIs themselves best understand the customs and practices of their discipline, and they can be important partners in this research program. They also are the ones who have the ability to determine when the products of their research are ready for publication and public dissemination. The success of an NSF program that focuses on research will depend on NSF working with universities and private companies to make the data available. Access to data is going to be extremely important. Next slide, please. So the recommendations are that the products of this research program on research security should not be used to disadvantage anyone based on their background. The program needs to emphasize research on effective methods for informing and training PIs about potential risks. The research program should focus on encouraging research programs in collaboration with other international organizations. As part of the proposed research program, NSF should encourage collaborations between social scientists and other STEM researchers. NSF should work closely with US STEM professional societies to maximize access of research program awardees to STEM researchers and disseminate educational and training materials. And we should work with other federal agencies that have a major stake in unclassified basic and applied research to create a database so that that database is accessible to the researchers doing research in this area. Next slide, please. So let me, before I turn to Jean, just say for this Research on Research Security program, we have a Dear Colleague letter that's out on the street because we want to start with a workshop, and we would love a PI to organize a workshop for us to bring together researchers from different disciplines to help form a new, unique research on research security discipline. We also have a lot of international interest, and so we're going to invite international partners to this workshop as well. The next stage will then be next year. We will start funding projects through a solicitation in this Research on Research Security program. So again, happy to answer more questions on any of those topics, but let me turn it over to Jean. Thanks.
Did you want to have her questions taken now, or do you want to wait? Because she has some questions in the chat.
We're going to wait, Jean, and do the all 5 federal speakers first, and then do a
perfect
Q&A.
All right.
Yeah.
Perfect. I didn't want to steal any more of Rebecca's thunder. Well, thank you all for inviting us yet one more time. Michelle and I have been on these sessions, as Jim Luther mentioned, for about 5 years now, and it seems like we've been talking about harmonization for over 5 years now. And we're very excited in that real progress is being made in this space. And we want to talk to you very briefly about what we've done over this last period since our last meeting with you all, and you know, where we are now and where what the next steps are to bring us home on this harmonization or development of common forms for the biographical sketch and current and pending other support. So at our last meeting, Michelle went over for you the changes that had been made as a result of the comment process, first initial Federal Register public comment process. We had received over 100 comments, and we made many changes to address the concerns raised as part of our revision and development process. So since that time, we've been working very hard, and our last step was to develop and post a second 30-day Federal Register notice. That is the second part of the Paperwork Reduction Act process. So why is NSF engaged in terms of this part of the process? Well, NSF is serving, as I've mentioned a number of times, as steward of these common forms. And that means we're taking responsibility for developing a page on the NSF website that talks about the common forms, has information that walks through the Federal Register notices that have been published, the comment tables, the latest versions, et cetera. And we continue to do that in our role as steward of posting this second Federal Register notice for public comment. We also, as part of this process, did a real deep dive into, and even though you could say you've done this before, we wanted to make sure absolutely every I was dotted and T was crossed, and NSF and NIH both did that. And I'm pleased to say that a number of the things that were found as part of this second Federal Register notice, we had already corrected because we were doing that final step of due diligence. One other point I would like to make about this 30-day Federal Register notice is that we really emphasized what are basically the underlying principles that we have been operating with since day one in every one of the sessions that we have been doing. And those principles are to look at the purpose of each of these common forms and make sure whatever we're doing is in line with that purpose statement. That kept us to a point where we could always point back to the biographical sketch is to help understand whether the individual or team has the necessary qualifications to carry out the research as proposed. Do all of those data elements relate to that and help answer those questions? Similarly, current and pending other support is, does the individual have the capacity to carry out the research as proposed given all of their other current and pending activities? And is there any overlap or duplication? So with this step in the process, we made sure that every one of the comments we received and how we address them, Michelle and I, we made sure that we looked at that statement of what are the purpose? Does it meet that purpose, or are they asking for additional information? So as part of this process then, we asked, and the notice was published on August 7th, 2023, and the comment period closed September 11th, 2023. And we asked in the Federal Register notice for your focus on fatal flaws. We have already resolved an awful lot of comments, both as part of the federal process and then as part of the original initial Federal Register notice, that we really felt like we had moved to a point where we really just wanted to address those major stop now kinds of issues. We received a total of 18 comments from one federal agency, one nonprofit organization, one institution of higher education, and 4 professional societies. And as I mentioned, I was very pleased that a lot of the initial and final cleanup work that we did helped us resolve some of what even came in as part of that process. And so some of the big topical areas that are worth mentioning are the area of malign foreign talent recruitment programs. As many of you know, we have updated the definitions document that was in NSPM-33 implementation guidance, and we have updated definitions. And one of them is on malign foreign talent recruitment programs. And so we have that definition in there. Yes, there was a comma after the and that was for the A and the B, and we have removed that comment on that comma. So, but please, the fundamental issue is really that as part of each one of these common forms, each senior or key individual will be certifying that they are not a party to a malign foreign talent recruitment program. We also had a similar issue in the area of consulting. Thank you very much, FDP. We used your language and had a minor edit to make in that space as well. We had some cleanup work that we had done. It's very clear now in the area of in-kind contributions. Michelle and I spent a lot of time on this in-kind contribution area, and I believe we've made a very number of positive step forward to ensure that the individuals reporting now fully understand what the expectations are, that it's $5,000 or more, and that there is an associated time commitment. And the document absolutely is clean in that regard as well. There were a number of comments in the initial area about the fact that the burden hours that NSF had posted were perhaps not as realistic. We've addressed that issue, and thank you very much to AAMC, who said that the numbers that we use were much more in line with what they believe the numbers should be. So we really have done our due diligence on these 18 comments, and Michelle and I have now this week turned over the documents again, including a new comment table with responses on each of the 18 comments to the co-chairs of the Research Security Subcommittee. And we're very, very excited about that step. There are some next steps that will continue to have to be completed. We are working to help draft communication to the agencies that would implement these on behalf of OSTP. We know that there will be a need for engagement with you as these eventually are rolled out. And we also understand things like FAQs will be necessary as well. With that, I really would like to give Michelle an opportunity, as I always do, to throw in always her sage comments on things I may have missed. Michelle.
I really don't think you've missed anything. I think you covered everything nicely. I do want to reiterate the fact that when Jean and I and our respective staff members went through the comments, way before we got the comments, we really did go back to make sure that we addressed all of those smaller issues. We really did. And those were taken care of. But I do want to just reiterate the need for us to be very clear that many of the substantive changes that we made as it related to in-kind contributions, the definitions, that kind of thing, truly came from the input of the community. We did receive additional comments that I do believe from various organizations that I do believe we had already addressed. But I think at this point, we need to begin to socialize implementation and recognize that, NIH, NSF, and many of the other federal agencies are truly in partnership to try to make this work for all of us. I think it's new for, our federal partners, but I also think that this is something that we've been doing for a while now. So much of what we're doing is not very new, but harmonization is the thing that I think we've nailed, to be quite honest. And so I don't think you missed anything, Jean, but I do think it's really important that folks understand the number of burden hours that we've spent on top of many other areas that we have to oversee, to take under advisement and include language in the documentations, the interagency forms, where we truly have heard the community. We've had personal conversations with colleagues and friends across the FDP, our FDP members, our FDP colleagues, our federal partners, and you and I have taken some personal and professional hits in terms of trying to make sure that we leverage the playing field. So I just want to reiterate the fact that I'm truly proud that we were able to deliver a solid package. And I want to thank Mike and Rebecca specifically, because they have been very supportive of our efforts and have given us a lot of leeway in terms of other areas that we needed to address that may not have been as clear in terms of the definitions, in terms of making sure we came up with thresholds. So thank you, Rebecca and Mike, who isn't here. So I think that's all I have to say, to be quite honest with you.
Really want to focus on what NSF and NIH were doing. We want to focus on implementing these common forms, because that step is necessary for the agencies to have the guidance that they need to do their implementation. So we really believe that this has been an excellent and sometimes painful exercise, but definitely worthwhile, as Michelle said, in terms of the products that were ultimately developed. Now, there is a session tomorrow. I will tell you at the NSF update this morning or this afternoon. There were a lot of questions on Science CV. There is a Science CV session tomorrow, and I would encourage you all to attend because of the many, many questions that were asked as part of the NSF update. So I think that's basically it for us. And that's where we stand on the harmonized forms.
Yeah, and Jean, I just want to add, and Jim, sorry to jump in, but I think the main point here also for agency updates as it relates to this, the harmonization piece, is that we don't have agency updates because we're truly trying to wait to make sure that we align ourselves with the interagency forms. So for NIH or NSF to go out on its own doing and updating something that has not been fully approved yet, I think that would be disingenuous. So we really are waiting to make sure that everything is approved. And then NIH will absolutely adopt whatever is approved by OSTP. There may be areas where we collect information on a different form in terms of a part of the package, but we will absolutely adopt the interagency forms effort. We've put too much time in. We've worked with the community very closely. And so for us not to do so would be disingenuous, and that's just not going to happen here.
And you have NSF commitment that we plan to move forward with the implementation of the common forms as well. So that's what we're prepared to talk about today. So with that, I turn it back over to Jim to let us know who's speaking next.
Great, Michelle, if I could just take 30 seconds, and then if you have any other NIH updates, I turn my camera on just to acknowledge what you all have done, the whole team on here, but the collaboration between your two organizations. I remember some of the early discussions, 4 years ago, and the burden discussions and different definitions, and harmonization has been a theme in FDP from the standpoint of from reducing burden for decades. And this is a realization of that, both in sprints that led to a marathon. And it's 5 years of that, and it's remarkable. And again, this is not lessening the great work that any of the other agencies have done, but it's so valuable. And I just want to turn my camera on for a minute because in a live audience, you probably might have gotten a standing ovation or lots of smiles and acknowledgement, and you're not seeing that here. I just wanted to mention that. But now, Michelle,
Thank you.
I'm going to turn it over to you to ask if there's anything, any hot topics that NIH might want to talk about that might be in the forefront of your mind, or maybe of the audience.
I don't have any hot topics. I did hear across the grapevine, though, the wave, the internet waves, that there may be some questions. And so if there are questions for me, I don't want to dominate the time. Happy to take those as it relates to, international activities.
Do you want to just take a minute? We do have the time. If you just want to take a minute, and then we can answer the questions later on. But for those that aren't familiar with this change, maybe everybody is, on the international subawards, could you hit the highlights of that?
So there's not really a change. I think what NIH has been very clear about is that we had a OIG audit where we were required to address foreign subawards and to make sure that we have all of the documentation that is required to inform a research progress report. NIH took seriously the guidance and the recommendation of the OIG. We have always said that, we need to have additional information and make that available as needed. What we determined was that we needed to unpack that statement. And so effective January 1, we just want to make sure that all of the information for subawards and documentation for subawards that informs the progress in a progress report is submitted or made available to NIH and to the Prime on a regular basis. It needs to be done annually. We started off with a very restrictive space, ended up really understanding and hearing the community's concerns about burden, and then move forward with making sure that all of the documentation that needs to inform or support the RPPR is available annually. It does not need to be mailed. I think we did a webinar and that was made clear that it doesn't need to be mailed in boxes, but made available in any platform that an institution can make available and obtain the information for NIH. We do know that the community was very concerned about many implications of collaborating with foreign institutions. That is definitely not the intention. We strongly encourage you to listen to the webinar and to take under advisement the FAQs, as well as the session that Larry Tabak did, as well as Mike Lauer, so that we can just make sure that the community and NIH is in a settled and in a strong place, that this really is about informing the progress and wanting to make sure that we were very responsive to the OIG's recommendation.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. That's a great update. Now, our next slide, Sarah. Now we'll turn it over to, I think, Jason.
Hi. It's good to be talking to everyone today. Usually when DoD presents here, it's either Bindu or myself, and we don't present any slides. And now we're going to make up for it by doing 15 slides in 10 minutes. So, we've got a lot to present today, though. So hope that's okay with everyone. So next slide. So again, we're going to be talking about the policy on risk-based security reviews that the Undersecretary published on June 30th. And that's going to detail the policy, the DoD component risk-based security reviews, any mitigation or rejection decisions that are made, the oversight that's done by the USD R&E, the decision matrix that we've developed to support these conflict of interest reviews, and finally the 1286 lists of problematic foreign institutions that we were required to develop pursuant to the National Defense Authorization Act. So on the next slide, now I know all of you know this, but just quickly, this is only about the policies I'm talking about here are only for fundamental research proposals. So those are proposals where we would openly publish the results of that. Foreign nationals are welcome to participate. And this is also done to be in compliance with National Security Presidential Memorandum 33. So going on to the next slide. The Deputy Secretary of Defense signed out a memorandum on December 14th of last year, and that said that the USD R&E, so my big boss, is in charge of ensuring a consistent implementation of NSPM-33 across all of the DoD components and also with other federal agencies, and to make sure that we are well aligned with OSTP on what we're doing. So if we go on to the next slide. The response to that is that on June 30th of this year, we published 3 documents on defense.gov, and that was one, a policy for risk-based security reviews for fundamental research proposals, a DoD component decision matrix to inform fundamental research proposal mitigation decisions. And finally, the list of institutions published in response to Section 1286 of the FY19 Defense Authorization Act. That was the problematic foreign institutions that I had mentioned. So going on to the next slide, the key takeaways from all of this is that the department is committed to preserving open science and international collaboration and the involvement of talented foreign researchers in DoD-funded fundamental research. We are going to try to mitigate potential conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment. Our intention in all of this is to get to yes. It's not to reject a lot of proposals. And in keeping with that, we're also going to try to be transparent and consistent across the department. So something that the Army decides should be very similar to a decision that Air Force or Navy decide. And the department will not discriminate on the basis of race or national origin, as in keeping with NSPM-33. And another question, you'll see a lot of dates. I don't have the matrix reproduced in these slides, but you'll see a lot of dates on our decision matrix. And the reason for that is we're not trying to penalize people that took actions that were considered to be appropriate, many years ago. But after the former Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, Mike Griffin, signed a letter to academia that was describing some of those problems, we feel like it's more fair at that point to start to take a look at some of the activities that happened. And finally, the department wants to collect feedback on this policy. We know we're not going to get it right at the first time out the gate. The decision matrix in particular is something that we consider a living document. We'll try to adjust that as need be. So please let us know, and I'll give you some contact information at the end. What are the challenges? What are the hangups? What are the things where we may need to go back and rethink things a little bit? So going on to the next slide. So according to the policy memo that was signed out, this is what DoD component policies have to do. After they've ensured that something is fundamental research, if something is selected for an award, so this isn't for every proposal that comes through, they have to look at the disclosures that are listed in the standard form 424, and of course the common disclosure form, which we'll be using once that becomes available. And they'll compare that to relevant publicly available information to ensure that all of the appropriate disclosures have been made. They'll also conduct annual reviews using the RPPRs that are submitted. These reviews, both at the proposal stage and following up at the award stage, are not meant to discourage international research collaboration, and we are trying to minimize the impact on time to award. So if we're directing components that if they feel like something is likely to be selected for award, to also conduct that risk-based security review at the same time. Now, that said, we do want there to be mitigations rather than the rejections. So the mitigation process may add some time to that, but we're hopeful that that will be limited to a very small number of proposals and not the vast majority of them. And then finally, we want to make sure that there's that for risks that rise to a certain level, that components have policies that are able to elevate that decision to someone in the department's in the component's leadership that can make those decisions if there's something that's considered particularly risky. We don't want a program manager having to sign off on that, but we still want there to be a technical decision that's being made and not a security veto. All right, so next slide. So in mitigation, as I said, we're trying to mitigate rather than reject. And so there's a variety of things that we have prescribed to components that they could ask for to mitigate any perceived risk on a proposal. For example, the covered individual could be required to complete insider risk awareness training, such as from the module that NSF is developing. They might ask to increase the reporting frequency of the RPPR. In some cases, we might ask that individuals on the research project be replaced. We may ask that any problematic contracts that have been identified are the contents of those contracts are disclosed to the department. And in some cases, we might ask an individual to resign from certain positions at foreign institutions that we consider problematic. Denials, so we're going on to the next slide. Denials are only going to occur when the risks are unable to be mitigated or if it's required by law. For example, for malign foreign talent recruitment programs, obviously that's something that's required by law that we reject as of next year. So those things are not going to be able to be mitigated. The denials must be explained in writing to the institution, and including an unclassified rationale. We don't want to have to say, well, we think this is problematic, but we can't tell you why. We're trying to be as transparent as possible with all of this. And institutions can challenge a denial that's made on the basis of a perceived research security risk, and OUSD R&E will look at it and make sure that the appropriate policies are being followed in that. On the next slide, on OUSD R&E oversight, as I said, the denials are going to be reported to OUSD R&E and to the other components. So then if the Army makes a denial, our hope is that there's a good rationale for that, and so that an Army denial should be the same as an Air Force denial, should be the same as a Navy denial, that all of those are going to look similar. The components are all going to provide R&E with a summary of the reviews that they do, including the rationales for denials that they make on an ongoing basis. We also may make spot checks on component policies, and we're also going to make sure that the component policies are not only in line with other DoD components, but also with other federal agencies. So we want to be, working in lockstep with NIH, NSF, and DOE in all of this. Skipping on to the next slide, and actually you can skip past the decision matrix slide onto our decision matrix, which I don't have here just for brevity, has 4 components in it. So the first one is foreign talent recruitment programs. This would include malign foreign talent recruitment programs, includes foreign funding sources. If an individual receives funding from a foreign country of concern, that might be a reason that might involve a conflict of interest. And so that might be a reason for us to ask for a proposal to have some mitigation done to it if it's going to be funded. Patents, if a patent was filed in another country for research that was funded by the US government, it was filed in another country long before it was filed in the US. And this isn't like a WIPO type of situation. This isn't where you filed it internationally and it just so happened that it happened in country X first before it happened in the US. This is, say it was filed in, say, China or Russia and not in the US, and a long time went past. And finally, any of the entity lists that we have listed in the matrix, and that includes things like the Department of Commerce entity list, but also the 1286 list and some other things that we're required to consider from National Defense Authorization Acts. And also to note, we have affiliations and associations that are noted with these problematic entities. And here, an affiliation is something where you're being funded or given some sort of monetary or non-monetary reward for the things that you're doing. An association, which would be considered somewhat less than that, is some sort of position where there's no monetary reward. So it's strictly an honorary degree or position or something like that. Next slide, and skipping past the 1286 list slide onto the next one. So just to say a brief bit about the 1286 list that we've published. There's 2 different lists, actually. One of them is the problematic institutions in the countries, as you can see there. And the second one is the foreign talent programs that pose a threat to national security interests. And for the 1286 list of institutions, we have limited that to only to foreign institutions where we feel like there's good documented U.S. government sources that problematic behavior, as specified in Section 1286, has occurred. So this would be things like being on the Department of Commerce entity list, because they typically do that type of vetting for institutions on that list, and also from Justice Department court cases. So in court case filings that we've looked through, if we see activity that's been of the sort that we have to take into account per 1286, then they'll appear on the list for that reason. Finally, going on to the next slide, and this is my last one. As I said, we don't expect that we're going to be completely clear about how this is supposed to work. So please, if you have any questions, and if we don't get to them today, you can contact us. There's the academic liaison mailbox. Dr. Nair reads that one. I read that one. Some of my colleagues do too. If you have a question on something, please reach out. We'll get back to you. And we look forward to working with you and improving this process and making it as clear and transparent as we can. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Jeremy, it's all yours.
Great, thanks so much. And I'm very impressed that Jason was able to get through so much great content and be concise in such a short amount of time. Very impressive. I'm going to do my best actually to keep us on track in terms of scheduling. So my name is Jeremy Ison. I work for Dr. Harry Kong, who generally represents the department at a number of these types of events. So what I'd like to do is provide some updates on what the department has been doing in the research security space over the last number of years. So I think a number of folks are familiar with the Science and Technology Risk Matrix, so different from the decision matrix for DoD, not to create confusion. That is a document that was created in partnership with the chief scientists of the national laboratories. It identifies emerging research and critical research technologies that have potential economic competitiveness or national security implications if there are breakthroughs in that. In general, the research portfolio for the S&T Risk Matrix is fundamental research, right? Or kind of a lower technology readiness level for more of the applied topics. We have back in 2019 that risk matrix was developed and issued. I think an important point to clarify upfront, since we receive this question quite often, is that the S&T risk matrix only applies to national laboratories. So it applies to 3 kind of general international transaction spaces. It also only applies to countries of concern, right, which we're all familiar with. Those transaction spaces are limited to travel to countries of concern on specific topics. So this red, yellow, green areas being generally the topics that have the most economic competitiveness implications and certainly have protections. But I should note that it doesn't have a prohibition for, or even really a restriction for traveling to countries of concern on those topics. It just generally has to go through an additional review process. And another point to add, and for areas that are not red, there are no limitations in terms of these engagements. So an update for the risk matrix to share with this group. I know we've had this concern has been raised to DOE in the past, that we've been very close hold with that document. It's controlled unclassified information in its entirety. And we've placed some limitations in terms of it being disseminated even within the lab complex. We are now working on, we have a draft unclassified version of the risk matrix that will be broadly disseminated inside of the National Laboratory Complex, as well as we're in discussions even having a broader dissemination of that. We feel kind of that serves 2 purposes. One, of course, there's the controls around kind of the red areas, right? So that won't be included in the unclassified version. But really what we want to do is just raise the level of awareness in terms of where those thresholds are, where we're getting to points where there are those economic competitiveness implications when we have breakthroughs. So that has been, we've also updated the risk matrix as of late last year, and it has been issued to the national labs. So again, we expect to have a non-CUI, non-controlled unclassified information version much more broadly disseminated in the very near future, certainly within the next few months. Going back from kind of a just kind of general framework for kind of how DOE approaches these issues, since I've been involved in them, that we really want to strike the right balance between protecting what's been identified as most important while also not do anything that would potentially impact negatively the scientific ecosystem, the openness of the scientific ecosystem. So we're trying to be very, very thoughtful about the approach in developing these types of policies. We develop it in partnership with the national labs. Certainly, we look at forums like this to help us better refine financial assistance policies as well. So looking forward to discussions around those topics. DOE was actually the first agency to develop a policy on prohibiting laboratory employees from participating in talent recruitment programs sponsored by countries of concern. And we've worked very, very closely with all my colleagues here in ensuring that any new additional requirements, in particular when it comes to the financial assistance transaction space, that it's done with harmonious intent in terms of requirements. I think one thing to share, I'm not sure if this was shared during the last meeting, we have had some maturation over the last few years. Of course, the talent program, prohibition. But one of the things that has developed in addition to that over the last year is that now we do have a department-wide working group focused on research security issues that reports to the Secretary's office. And I co-chair that with a few other colleagues. In addition to that, separate, but in addition to that, we do have a new Office of Research Technology and Economic Security that a colleague of mine heads. They are responsible in providing assistance to program offices when it comes to kind of risk reviews associated with financial assistance. So with that, I think what I'd like to do is turn it back over to Jim and happy to answer any questions that participants might have.
Thank you, Jeremy. So I think we're ready to launch into the Q&A segment that we have. I do want to start that by saying, if you can't see the responses in chat or in Q&A, there is an awful lot of support and thanks again to Michelle and Jean for all their work on the harmonized forms, and so much appreciation for everything that you've been able to achieve behind the scenes in terms of channeling us and making sure that what is developed works for the agencies and works for grantees. So again, thank you for that. So, okay, I'll ask the first question. Do any of the federal agencies anticipate expanding the application of the TikTok ban to include assistance agreements? For example, DOD's incorporation into cooperative agreements? Michelle, I know you had a written response to that.
Yeah,
Do you
for
want to offer
NIH, that is
Yeah.
not the case. It doesn't apply to cooperative agreements or grants.
Okay.
I can,
Same for NSF.
that's correct. We've had meetings on this.
Okay.
I would say for DoD, we haven't had a lot of discussions about it, but it's not something that I've been asked about lately. So unless there's a directive that I'm given to do so, then it's not something I'm anticipating.
Yeah, I think same for DOE is my understanding.
Thank you all very much for that. Jim, you want to ask the next one?
Yeah, Rebecca, this may be best fielded by you, although you may or may not have an answer. We're all waiting on pins and needles for the release of the research security standard requirements. At one point, we thought it might be the fall. Any update on that, or is that a question you can answer or give any insights to?
I'm actually meeting with OSTP tomorrow. There were many comments, thank you very much, that came into the draft standards. As you know, OSTP and we are taking those comments extremely seriously and making substantial revisions to the proposed proposed standards. The revisions are to allow more flexibility and to take into account the resource constraints at universities. And to focus as well more on a risk-based approach. So because there are going to be these revisions, it is taking longer. There is a revised draft. Something else that we're taking seriously into consideration is the FDP proposal for a pilot, which right now we're calling a commissioning phase because it sounds nicer. So that's something else that is very serious consideration. So that all to be said, it's going to take another few weeks to get this into a final form. It won't take that much longer after that, however. And we'll make sure, of course, that we give ample notice before the programs are required to be implemented.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's great.
So, this one may be a fast one as well. The question about the malign foreign talent recruitment program definition and the A and B or A or B in terms of it's being one or more characteristics of a malign foreign talent recruitment program as outlined in CHIPS and a country of concern?
Yes.
Or?
It's and there's
Okay.
no comma. Let's just make that clear.
Okay.
So
Yes.
it's trust. It's
So to
A
be,
and B.
yes. And
Okay.
so to clarify what that means, it has to have one of the characteristics from section A, and also it has to be originating in a country of concern.
Right.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I think maybe with the two of you, we've finally been able to put that question to bed. So thank you very much. So Jill?
Go ahead, Pamela, if you have
Oh, okay.
others that you've been looking at.
Oh, sure. So do we have a sense of whether the other agencies will follow suit with NIH and NSF about adoption of the common forms?
Yeah, I think we've worked really closely with all of our colleagues where this is, where it impacts their portfolio. And I have no doubt that we're all in agreement. And I think that there may be some differences, which is what the individual implied. But I don't think that there will be differences where it will be so different that there's such a huge administrative burden on the community. It might be collections in different places. I know I can speak for NIH, that we have certain areas that have just been a part of our historical fabric and tapestry. So we will still collect certain things certain ways just to support our portfolio and our granting authorities. But for the most part, we definitely will be adopting the interagency forms in whole cloth. And I think just working with Bindu and some of the others at DOE, it's just been a pleasure to try to align ourselves, and how that looks for everyone might be a little different depending on granting authorities. But for the most part, I think we're all aligned that we should be harmonized in this space.
And I think we've also got great support from OSTP and OIRA in making this happen as well. They're also partners in this process, and we really have tried to listen throughout this process to the concerns raised either by whether it be a federal agency, whether it be a security agency, whether it be an institution of higher education, and really listen to what the concerns were, and to the extent possible, address those in a way that will make them more usable by more federal agencies.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, if I can follow on with that, just to reiterate that DoD does anticipate just adopting the common forms once those are available, and really appreciate the work that Gene and Michelle have done. I've been able to collect comment from all of our DoD components on this and send those along, and I think that really helps within the department, probably within other agencies too, to give a good comfort level with the form. So I think that this will be an important thing for us to do to make sure that we're doing the same things as the other federal agencies.
If I could just jump in, I think it's really important though, that while Gene and I spearheaded it and, took on all of the, maybe shouldering some of the work, I feel like we all did this together, right? I mean, everybody gave their input. Everybody sat down at the table and talked about it. Gene and I pulled those comments together and we discussed it and went back and forth with the community. So while we did a large part of the work, I think we all together came up with a really good product. I gotta say though, that if we're gonna give anybody some credit, between Jason, Jeremy, and myself, we gotta turn to Jean, because she really has done a yeoman's job as well. So thank you, Jean.
You're welcome.
Okay. Jim, do you want to ask the next one?
Just a clarifying thing. There was a comment that people couldn't see Jeremy's slide. It looked like it was stuck on just his intro slide. He was talking just from an intro slide, so there were no other slides. There was also a couple of slides, Jason, to you asking about the matrix that you were referring to. I assume in all the links that you provided, all that is in your last slide?
I haven't actually clicked through the links myself, but to test it, but I think that it's there. And if it's not, I usually find it by searching DoD foreign influence, and it's usually the top link. Is that link to defense.gov. So if nothing else that works, then try that.
Okay.
That's great.
We have time for a couple more questions before we do our last segment. Michelle, a question for you. Was there consideration given to just having the foreign sub-policy apply only to the countries of concern?
So I answered that in writing, and I think the bottom line is that we addressed the OIG's recommendation.
Oh, okay.
We did. This applies to everyone, right? It applies to whether it's a, prime foreign or prime sub. The goal, though, of the OIG was to address the foreign subs, and that's exactly what NIH did.
Okay. Okay. So, and maybe one more general one. Do you have any recommendations as federal representatives for what you wish institutions would put in place for us to feel assured that our senior key personnel are not part of aligned foreign talent recruitment programs?
So,
it's your chance to tell us what to do.
Yeah, exactly. So I think this is a big challenge for institutions. Something that, of course, we know is that these malign foreign talent plans are signed with the individual and not through the institution.
Right.
And so something that we've seen as a best practice is to inform your conflicts office or your OGC or whoever is responsible. If you are a full-time faculty member and you have been presented with an agreement or arrangement that you are supposed to sign as an individual with another institution. I think that is something that could really raise the awareness. Now, it's very hard, of course, about the overall enforcement of that, but it is a really good best practice to let faculty members know that, it might start certainly with the offer to do a few lectures abroad, participate in some conferences. When it gets to that point of being presented with something to sign as an individual, that is when they should let their home institution know.
Thank you. I think there's one more in here that we're going to take, and then we'll jump to our last segment. And this is Jason for you. Do you have any recommendations for how institutions should navigate situations where a DoD agency has decided that a project isn't fundamental research, as defined either by the Carter memo or EAR, and then we're hearing, and some institutions seem to be experiencing the case where there's some internal fundamental research checklist in DoD that's inconsistent with the underlying guidance documents, and there's disagreement about whether something is or isn't fundamental research. Do you have any recommendations?
this is a challenging thing for us, right? We have, the Carter memo is still in effect, which says that if something is basic or applied, so 6.1 or 6.2 going out to universities, that is expected to be fundamental research. Now, the community does not have access to the information as to whether or not some work that is being funded comes out of those budget lines, right? So I think that's part of the challenge. And we in R&E have been trying to do the best we can to make sure that when we are aware of big projects that we see coming down that maybe we think should be fundamental but aren't, that we're having a conversation with folks. But you'll also see, and I think one of the things that we've seen a lot lately is things like these consortia pop up. And on the one hand, I think that these are a really good way of getting research out to a broad community, including potentially industry, and getting performers that you might not usually get. On the other side of that, a lot of times those funds come from more advanced programs that might not be classified as fundamental research. So there's not a one-size-fits-all answer to that. If you feel like something really is fundamental research, the first thing is you should do is talk to your program manager about it. Not like the grants or contracts officer per se, but like the program manager. If the program manager thinks it's fundamental research and something strange is going on, then maybe there should be some broader conversations around it. But there are some times when the program manager and even the grants officer or whoever else that's involved are all in lockstep on it, and this is supposed to be CUI because there's cover technical information involved with it. So I can't, unfortunately, give a uniform answer to all of that.
Okay. Well, thank you. So, okay. Jim, do you want to jump to our last segment?
Great. Next slide, Sarah. We have about 10 more minutes of content. We apologize for going past 5 o'clock. Hopefully those of you that can stay can stay. I know some probably have conflicts, but very quickly, my next 2 slides and Pamela's slides are a nice segue from Rebecca's comment about a commissioning phase, which I'd love to hear more about at some point, but that sounds exciting. But very briefly, as we wrap up this section, we wanted to talk about some of the things we talked about in the May meeting. We talked about a listening session that had occurred that focused on foreign travel security training, security program self-assessment, and implementation considerations. That was a listening session that we had with the National Science and Technology Council, with Rebecca and Michelle and Jean and Kei Kazumi and Bindu and many, many others, and they were wonderful discussions. We did a similar one, a listening session on listening session 2 that focused on faculty disclosure and MART and Science CV and BIosketch. We can take that offline. All of those PowerPoints are in the link that Pamela put at the bottom, right here in the light blue. But it was exciting discussion and great interaction. Next slide. And here's my last slide before I turn it over to Pamela. This slide talks about the uniqueness of FTP, and I think it's an exact slide that we discussed with the council and talked about how FTP can do the things that you see on the screen. Share effective practices, there's multi-directional feedback, an opportunity to get it from the breadth of institutions, to get input from faculty, to talk about things like implementation and enforcement timelines, and what institutions go through as they do things related to the research security standards. So I just wanted to set that up before I turn it over to Pamela. Pamela?
Thanks, Jim. Next slide. So I wanted to share with you what we did this summer to try and get our hands around all of this. As Jim said, we've had these listening sessions. We've been having good conversations between the members of the Foreign Influence Working Group, also, and the Research Security Subcommittee. And we started writing down everything we thought FTP might be able to assist with. And put that all into a master document with some kind of short descriptions of what that might look like. And then we took it out to these 2 committees just to get a sense of what do people think would be most impactful for FTP to do? Is it feasible also for FTP to do separately from that? Could we do it? And then we also asked the question of, could this be done just by FTP institutions, or is this really something that we really ought to be partnering with our federal partners in FTP in order to achieve it? Almost every item, the partnering came through as being a kind of a key element of what we would like to do. But we've just listed these here, and they're in the order of impact score. If you're wondering why the numbers at the left don't match, but that's matches to our document. But you can see there's going to be several here, and I'm just going to talk about those four that have red circles. Those were ones that both had very high impact scores, but also had high feasibility scores. So that it was the partnership of both of those scores. We actually calculated it 2 different ways, and it came out almost identically for that. But there's a lot of interest, and perhaps with Rebecca, what you said before, and Michelle and Jean, you said before, this may become less important when we see the final, but the idea of having a glossary of federally defined terms that also have definitions clean and concise enough to guide us as institutional users in our implementation processes, and consistency across institutions in how we believe something is intended to be defined was just seen as a very, very critical item. I'll jump down to that last one on the page. Some of you have already seen the very nice tool that has been decision-making tool that has been put together by Amanda Humphrey and Robin Sear at Northeastern University to help us decide when do investigators need to disclose something called MART. And that was also seen as a very powerful item. That was demoed at one of the listening sessions, and it will be demoed very soon to some FBI representatives as well. Next slide. 2 more items on this one that scored very highly. The idea that we could collectively draft some model research security program descriptions and promulgate those out for samples to the rest of the community that they might want to take advantage of in terms of how they describe their program. Again, it would be wonderful to be able to work with our federal partners on that. So we're getting the level of description that would be considered appropriate and viable for the intended purpose. And then really working with, we're already doing this, but working with federal agencies on the certification requirements and how can we best implement those? How can we do that in a way that's efficient, that doesn't duplicate, that is clear, concise, and effective? And then I'll just show you on the last slide the other items that didn't score perhaps as highly in the survey, but are still very much of interest to a significant number. None of these items got a low score. It was hard to differentiate in some cases given that. So we see this merely as a first step. But a first step to saying where might we wish as an organization to focus our attentions and focus our potential with our federal partners for demonstrations for FTP. And again, Rebecca, we very much look forward to working with you and talking more with you about this commissioning phase and how that might dovetail here very nicely with the work that's been done so far in terms of defining all of this. As you can tell, there's a lot, so it was necessary to start winnowing and so down. And with that, I think Michelle, please go ahead.
So I actually find number 7 to be extremely intriguing.
Okay.
And surprised it scored as low as it did, though you say all of them are kind of very important.
Yeah.
So what was the discussion and the thought behind those, the number 7, and how, because I think that that's an area where it would be a different spin.
Mm-hmm. I think this actually came out of discussions that we were having with Amanda Humphrey at Northeastern University, because we know that IRMA and has been talking actively, and there's been an effort in Europe to also identify good research security practices and also to vet collaborations that they may want to enter into. Recognizing that that effort exists, there seemed like there might be this possibility that we could join forces and we could figure out if we're identifying the same types of things, and also share data among ourselves so that we're harvesting, they could harvest US data, we might be able to harvest other, international data to be able to identify programs that we thought were particularly strong. So it was an early stage conversation. Jim, I don't know if you want to add to that, but that was the gist of it.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. I agree, Pamela. I mean,
Yeah.
I'd have to also, Michelle, look at some of the context behind that, but I think that's my recollection of it as well.
Okay, but thank you for telling
the
us
only
that.
other thing I'd add, Michelle, is something that you all said, and I remember Bindu a year ago, 2 years ago, when we were in person talking about good actors and bad actors are so much in the eye of the beholder, based on the science, based on the discipline, based on a million different things. And something that, so identifying either a good actor or a bad actor, if somebody, an entity might be a good actor if we're collaborating on Shakespeare, and they might be a bad actor if we're collaborating on AI. And so this whole concept of good and bad actors, and you can see the feasibility scores are kind of low, and that just means, can FDP do it? So I think it's definitely worth a conversation, but it's difficult.
I think the part of that I liked the best was that it was positive. Yeah,
I think that part of it too, but I think that it also, positive is subjective, right?
right.
But if you could, because for me, if we are consistently, bye, Rebecca. If we are consistently looking at bad actors, do we have criteria by which we identify those?
Mm-hmm.
Clear definitions that you talked about.
Right.
And then, of course, what the requirements are and the standards are for the research security training, which could pull that out.
Yes.
And create criteria. And I think that that's something that, while the feasibility study was low, I'm surprised, because I think that that's one thing that FDP does well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I can just channel Bindu for a second and sort of give that spiel. I think the challenge is not just that, it may be for some things and not for other things that there's a risk. That is true. We find things like key laboratories in China. Sometimes those have a very close connection with the PLA. But other departments or organizations within the same institution may not. So that's part of the challenge. But also, these things tend to change and change pretty frequently. And that's why the department is trying to make a flexible policy, is because these things change so much. And so I think that's the challenge. And it's not that there's not a utility to it. There is. It's just it's challenging. And so we're trying to prepare ourselves for that future.
Thank you, Jason. Wow. Okay, let me close out here. Next slide. So first, and we were doing questions, I think, a little bit there. So next slide. So I just wanted to take the chance to remind everyone that the Research Security Subcommittee also has a session at this meeting, and that's going to be held on Wednesday. And this is what they're going to be discussing at that. And I'm really hoping that all of you can join for that session as well. It promises to be a very good one. And finally, Jim and I just want to take the chance to thank all of our federal panelists who have, once again, been amazing. And gotten an enormous amount of information shared with the community in a very concise amount of time. So thank you very much. And we appreciate everyone who's had an opportunity to come today. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Pam. Always good.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.